because after the break, and thank you for coming in, after the break, travel editor Eoghan Corry will be joining me on why we need a plan for foreign travel from our government, not through medical briefings.
We would like people not to travel. Yes, and for some people, I know people will have made bookings. I think it makes much more sense to not go ahead with that booking.
Well, tonight there have been calls for government to clarify the confusion around travel or cancel flights following the remarks of Tony Holohan last night that people who had booked overseas trips should not travel. And with Ryanair due to ramp up their services from tomorrow, there is much confusion and mixed messages. I'm joined now by Eoghan Corry, editor of Air and Travel magazine. The real dilemma here, Eoghan, seems to be that people who've booked and paid for flights in these circumstances, if the plane takes off, they won't get the refund. Is that the biggest crux here?
Pretty much, Ivan. We've come from a period of mass cancellations, and a lot of viewers will be very familiar with going through the process of getting the refund from Aer Lingus and Ryanair. Now the flights are in place, it means that refunds are not going to be an option. So when we have this the confusion about what exactly the national policy is about whether you should go and travel abroad, the people who sacrifice or decide not to travel do not have the option of the refund anymore. It's a new period, and it's going to be quite messy unless we get some sort of coherent strategy and coherent guidance on this.
Now, last Thursday night, the last meeting of the caretaker government announced Airbridges to countries with low levels commensurate with our own level of COVID. Where does that stand?
We don't really know, because the Airbridge idea came pretty late into the game here. When you consider, Ivan, that the European Commission released their plan for the reopening of borders on May the 27th, they had a target of June the 15th, and most countries met that. Then the aviation side, the European Air Safety Authority, they released on, I think it was June the 12th, their policy in consultation with the European CDC on disease control. So we have at European level a strategy to try and get borders reopened in an orderly fashion, because when coronavirus struck in Italy in March, everything was most disorderly in the way borders were shuttered. Ireland has not been a participant in that process. Instead, we have a fairly crude and much criticised quarantine, a self-isolation, which is not mandatory because it's not legally binding. And that has been serving as almost our protection. And in the absence of political focus on this issue, with the interregnum and the handover and everything like that, what happened over the last weekend was that the medical advisors, the health advisors, moved in with very strong statements about not only not travelling, but people who had already booked holidays should cancel. It isn't government-backed. It isn't anybody's view except perhaps INFITs and perhaps individual medical advisors. But what we really need is the government to look at the European policy, and if they're not going to adopt it, come up with something else. Airbridges, we're not sure what countries are going to be there, what country are not. The people who've been applying it across Europe have applied either a 7-day metric or a 14-day metric. The country that misses out on most of it is Sweden. The other countries that miss out can be Poland, which would be hugely significant in Ireland, Bulgaria and Romania. Most of the other countries make it. But what we've been hearing from NFIT is we might adopt a completely different one, which is anybody with a higher rate of infection than Ireland is put under the red category, no Airbridge, and that would be quite drastic.
That's all focused on outbound. What about inbound? You're on the National Tourism Task Force. What's the perspective of the tourism industry?
This is existential. The tourist industry is shattered. It needs to try and pick up the pieces, get a little bit of the season that's already effectively lost. And it applies to both inbound and outbound. The 14-day mandate, the self-isolation 14-day mandate, actually applies to everybody arriving in Ireland. So what we've had, Ivan, is pretty terrible. We've had major tour operators in places like Germany looking across Europe and saying where is open and where is not. The message is Ireland is not open. So a lot of the people who booked their holidays in Ireland are being contacted and told, move that holiday to a country that's open. So instead of coping with the huge hurdles and the huge obstacles to get our tourism industry with 200,000 jobs at risk back in track, we're actually imposing extra obstacles and putting them up ourselves.
Eoghan Corry, as always, thank you.
Always a pleasure, Ivan.
There you have it, a total lack of political clarity or leadership. It's time perhaps for the new government to govern. That's all we have time for tonight. I'll be back on radio tomorrow at 4. And Matt will be here tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Until then, thanks to all our guests. Thanks for you to watching. Good night.